The wagon train had been attacked 3 days ago, and Maddox Dalton found the survivor while tracking deer through the Wyoming wilderness in late September of 1874. She sat huddled beneath an overturned wagon, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt, eyes wide with terror as he approached through the morning mist. He raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm, but she scrambled backward like a cornered animal, clutching a broken wagon spoke as though it might protect her from this massive stranger with his worn buckskins and shoulder-length brown hair. "Easy now," Maddox said quietly, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "I won't hurt you." She stared at him, comprehension absent from her frightened eyes, and that was when he realized she did not understand a single word he had spoken. The bodies around the destroyed wagon train told a grim story. Raiders had swept through, taking everything of value and leaving death in their wake. Maddox counted 12 dead, including women and children, and his jaw tightened as he surveyed the carnage. He had seen violence before in these mountains, but it never sat easier with him. This young woman, barely into her 20s by the look of her, had somehow survived by hiding. Her dress was torn and stained, her hands scraped raw, but she appeared unharmed beyond cuts and bruises. He tried English again, then what little Spanish he knew, but she only watched him with those huge, terrified eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse and trembling with words that sounded nothing like anything he had ever heard. The cadence was strange, the syllables unfamiliar, flowing together in a way that felt both beautiful and utterly foreign. Maddox was a practical man, 28 years old with shoulders broad enough to carry an elk and arms corded with muscle from years of surviving alone in the mountains. He had left civilization behind 5 years ago after the war had taken everything from him, preferring the company of pine trees and wildlife to the complexities of human society. But he could not leave this terrified young woman alone in the wilderness to die. He gestured to himself. "Maddox," he said clearly, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She hesitated, then whispered something that sounded like Yara, though he could not be certain. When he repeated it, trying to match her pronunciation, the smallest flicker of relief crossed her face. Getting her to trust him enough to follow took the better part of an hour. He showed her his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Red, and gathered what supplies remained scattered around the destroyed wagon train. There were papers among the debris, documents written in a script he did not recognize. He pocketed them anyway, thinking perhaps someone in Winnetka might be able to read them and help him understand where this woman had come from. Yara, as he decided to call her, finally allowed him to help her onto Red when he pointed toward the mountains and pantomimed shelter. She was shaking, whether from cold or fear or both, and Maddox gave her his heavy coat before leading the horse on foot. His cabin was a full day's journey away, and they needed to move before the weather turned worse. The walk gave him time to think. He lived alone in the mountains northwest of Winnetka, Wyoming, trapping and hunting and only venturing into town 3 or 4 times a year to sell pelts and buy necessities. His life was solitary by choice, uncomplicated by the demands and disappointments of human connection. Now he had a traumatized young woman who spoke no English depending entirely on him for survival. They stopped at midday beside a clear stream. Yara slid from the horse without waiting for help, nearly collapsing when her legs buckled beneath her. Maddox caught her, his large hands gentle despite their roughness, and helped her sit against a tree. She flinched from his touch but did not pull away, too exhausted to maintain her wariness. He built a small fire and heated water, mixing in herbs to make a simple tea. When he offered it to her, she studied the cup suspiciously before taking a tentative sip. The warmth seemed to revive her somewhat, and she drank it all, then ate the dried meat and hardtack he provided without complaint. Maddox watched her covertly as he prepared his own meal. She was younger than him by several years, probably 20 or 21, with delicate features and olive-toned skin that suggested Mediterranean or Middle Eastern heritage. Her eyes were a striking dark brown, almost black, framed by thick lashes. Even dirty and scared, she possessed a quiet dignity that spoke of strength beneath the fear. After they ate, Maddox tried again to communicate. He pointed to objects and named them slowly. Tree, water, sky, horse. Yara watched intently but did not repeat the words. Instead, she began pointing to the same objects and saying words in her own language, her voice growing slightly stronger with each one. Maddox listened carefully, trying to commit the foreign sounds to memory. When she pointed to the tree and said what sounded like "Daraket," he repeated it, stumbling over the unfamiliar pronunciation. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time since he had found her, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched her lips. They continued that way for perhaps 20 minutes, trading words back and forth. Maddox had always been good with languages, picking up various Native American dialects during his years in the mountains through necessity and respect. This was different, harder, but he found himself determined to bridge the gap between them. The loneliness in her eyes called to something deep inside him, a recognition of his own isolation reflected back. By the time they resumed their journey, Maddox had learned perhaps a dozen words in her language, and Yara had heard just as many in English. It was nowhere near enough for real conversation, but it was a beginning. The sun was setting when they finally reached his cabin, a sturdy structure he had built himself from logs cut in the surrounding forest. It sat in a small clearing beside a creek, with mountains rising dramatically behind it and a view of the valley spreading out below. Smoke would rise from the stone chimney on cold mornings, and in summer wildflowers carpeted the meadow nearby. It was beautiful in its isolation, exactly what Maddox had wanted when he chose this spot. Yara looked around with wide eyes as he helped her down from Red. She swayed on her feet, and he steadied her with one hand on her elbow, noting the fever flush starting to color her cheeks. The ordeal had taken its toll, and she needed rest and proper care. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A large bed occupied one corner, a stone fireplace dominated another wall, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat near the single window. Shelves held his meager possessions, and furs covered the floor and bed. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the herbs he dried from the rafters. Maddox settled Yara in his chair near the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until warmth flooded the small space. He heated water and found clean cloths, then knelt before her and gestured to her hands. She held them out hesitantly, and he cleaned the scrapes and cuts with gentle efficiency. Her breath hissed when he applied a salve he made from pine resin and herbs, but she did not pull away. When he tried to check the cut on her head, she jerked back instinctively. He held up his hands, making himself as unthreatening as possible despite his size, and repeated the gesture more slowly. This time she allowed it, trembling as his calloused fingers carefully parted her hair to examine the wound. It was not deep, already beginning to scab over, but he cleaned it anyway and applied more salve. "You'll be all right," he murmured, knowing she could not understand the words but hoping his tone conveyed reassurance. "You're safe here." Yara's eyes filled with tears, and she spoke rapidly in her own language, the words tumbling out in a torrent of emotion. Maddox wished desperately that he could understand, could offer more than just his presence and protection. Instead, he squeezed her hand briefly, then stood to prepare food. He made a simple stew from dried venison and vegetables from his root cellar, along with fresh bread he had baked 2 days prior. Yara ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, but she finished everything in her bowl. Exhaustion was winning the battle against fear, her eyelids drooping as the warmth and full stomach worked their magic. Maddox faced a dilemma. He had only one bed, and it was clear Yara needed to lie down before she fell from the chair. He could take the floor, would take the floor, but he needed to communicate that to her without frightening her further. He pointed to the bed, then to her, then made a show of spreading furs on the floor near the fire and pointing to himself. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by what looked like protest. She gestured to the bed and then to him, then to herself and the floor, clearly trying to say he should keep his bed and she would sleep on the ground. Maddox shook his head firmly. He was twice her size and accustomed to sleeping rough. More importantly, she was injured and in shock, and needed the comfort more than he did. He helped her to the bed, noting how she could barely stand, and turned his back to give her privacy to remove her torn dress. When he turned around again, she had wrapped herself in one of his shirts, which hung nearly to her knees and crawled beneath the heavy furs on his bed. Her eyes were already closing, fever and exhaustion claiming her consciousness. Maddox checked her forehead, frowning at the heat he felt there, then settled on his makeshift bed on the floor to keep watch through the night. She woke several times, crying out in fear or delirium, and each time Maddox was there, his deep voice soothing even when his words made no sense to her. He gave her water and kept the fire burning bright, and slowly the long night passed. Morning light filtered through the window when Yara finally woke fully. Maddox was already up, making breakfast, and he brought her tea and more of the herbal mixture that would help with fever. She accepted it gratefully, and this time when their eyes met, there was less fear and more curiosity in her gaze. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Maddox tended to his traps and hunted for food while Yara rested and regained her strength. Each evening, they sat together by the fire, and he began the slow, patient work of learning her language. He discovered her language was Persian, though he did not know to call it that at first. The papers he had found at the wagon train were written in elegant script that meant nothing to him, but Yara's eyes had filled with tears when she saw them. She had pressed them to her chest like something precious, and he understood they must have belonged to someone she lost. Maddox had always been a quick study, his mind sharp despite his preference for solitude. He started with simple things, everyday objects and actions, writing down phonetic approximations of the Persian words in his journal and practicing them throughout the day. Yara proved to be a patient teacher, though she too was learning English words, and they helped each other stumble through the linguistic divide. "Bread," he would say, holding up a piece. "Naan," she would reply, and he would repeat it until he got the pronunciation right. "Water," he would say, and she would respond with ab, correcting his accent when he mangled the unfamiliar sounds. It was slow going, but each day brought new words, new understanding. Maddox found himself looking forward to their evening lessons, watching the way Yara's face lit up when he successfully mastered a difficult word, or how she laughed softly when he made a particularly funny mistake. Laughter, he discovered, was the same in any language. As Yara grew stronger, she began helping around the cabin. She insisted on cooking, taking over the simple meals he prepared and transforming them with herbs and techniques he had never encountered. She cleaned and organized without being asked, and mended his clothes with neat, tiny stitches that put his own rough repairs to shame. She was making the cabin feel less like a lonely shelter and more like a home, though Maddox was not quite ready to examine what that meant. 2 weeks after he had found her, Maddox woke to find Yara standing at the window, staring out at the mountains with tears streaming silently down her face. He approached slowly, concerned, and she turned to him with such profound sadness in her eyes that his chest tightened. She spoke in Persian, the words halting and broken by emotion, but he had learned enough to catch some meaning. Family. Dead. Alone. Lost. Maddox did not think, just pulled her into his arms, tucking her head beneath his chin as she finally broke down and sobbed. She clung to his shirt, her small frame shaking with grief, and he held her through it all, one large hand stroking her hair while he murmured wordless comfort. When the storm passed, Yara pulled back, wiping her eyes and clearly embarrassed by her display. But Maddox caught her hands, holding them gently, and spoke in careful Persian. "You're not alone, I hear." It was clumsy, grammatically wrong, but understanding flashed across her face. Fresh tears welled up, but these seemed different, softer. She squeezed his hands in return and replied in equally broken English. "Thank you. You good man." Something shifted between them in that moment, the relationship transforming from simply survivor and rescuer into something deeper, more connected. The lessons continued with renewed intensity. Maddox spent his days not just hunting and trapping, but practicing Persian phrases in his head, trying to build enough vocabulary to have real conversations. Yara did the same with English, and slowly, painfully, they began to bridge the gap. A month after finding her, Maddox could conduct basic conversations in Persian. It was far from fluent, his accent was terrible, and he frequently mixed up words or grammar, but Yara understood him more often than not. Her English had progressed similarly, and they developed a hybrid communication style that mixed both languages with gestures and facial expressions. It was during one of their evening lessons that Maddox finally learned her full story. Yara's family had fled Persia after her father, a teacher and scholar, ran afoul of local authorities for his progressive views on education and women's rights. They had made the difficult journey to America seeking freedom and opportunity, arriving in New York before joining a wagon train heading west to California, where they had heard of other Persian families establishing themselves. "We were so close," Yara said softly in Persian, which Maddox now understood. "Only a few more weeks," my father said. "Then the men came in the night." She had hidden in a water barrel at her mother's desperate command, listening in terror as the raiders attacked. By the time she dared emerge, everyone was dead, including her parents and her younger brother. She had survived 3 days alone, drinking rainwater and too traumatized to leave the limited safety of the overturned wagon. "I wanted to die too," she confessed, staring into the fire. "I thought I should have died with them. What was the point of living when everyone I loved was gone?" Maddox felt his throat tighten. He understood that feeling, that survivor's guilt that ate at you in the dark hours. He had felt it after the war when so many of his friends had not come home. "I'm glad you lived," he said in Persian, the words coming easier now. "I'm glad I found you." Yara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing perhaps for the first time the loneliness that matched her own in his gray eyes. "Why do you live alone?" she asked. "A man like you should have a wife, a family." Maddox was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to share. But she had trusted him with her pain, and he found he wanted to offer his own in return. "I had a fiancée before the war," he said slowly in English, knowing she would understand most of it. "Rebecca. She promised to wait for me. When I came back 4 years later, she was married to my brother. They had 2 children. He paused, the old hurt still there but duller now. "Everyone I knew in my town looked at me different, like I was a stranger. I was angry all the time, didn't know how to be around people anymore, so I left. Came to the mountains where I didn't have to pretend to be the man I was before. Yara reached out and took his hand, her small fingers threading through his larger ones. I understand, she said softly. Sometimes it is easier to be alone than to be lonely among others. They sat that way for a long time, hands clasped, staring into the fire and drawing comfort from each other's presence. October brought the first serious snow, dusting the mountains in white and signaling the long winter ahead. Maddox made a trip into Winnetka to stock up on supplies before the passes became impassable, and he brought Yara with him, reasoning she could not stay hidden in the mountains forever. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, saloon, church, and a handful of other businesses. People stared at Yara as they rode in, curiosity and suspicion clear in their faces. A foreign woman arriving with the hermit mountain man was certainly something to talk about. Maddox kept her close as they went about their business, his size and stern expression discouraging anyone from asking intrusive questions. At the general store, the proprietor, an older man named Samuel, was kinder than most. "Heard about the wagon train attack," Samuel said quietly as he tallied their purchases. "Terrible business. She a survivor?" "Yes," Maddox replied curtly, not inviting further conversation. Samuel nodded, glancing at Yara with sympathy. "Must have been hard losing everyone. At least she's got you to look after her." The words were innocent enough, but they planted a seed in Maddox's mind that he could not shake. Yara did have him, but for how long? What was his plan? He could not keep her in the mountains indefinitely. She deserved a life, a future, more than what his isolated existence could provide. But the thought of her leaving, of returning to some form of civilization without him, made his chest ache in a way he did not fully understand. On the ride back to the cabin, Yara was quiet, overwhelmed by the trip and the stairs and the reminder that she was very much alone in this strange country. When they arrived home, as she had begun to think of the cabin, she went immediately to the window and stood staring out at the darkening mountains. "Do you regret it?" Maddox asked in Persian, coming to stand beside her. "Coming with me instead of going to town, trying to find your way to California?" Yara turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "No," she said firmly. "You saved my life, not just from dying, but from being alone in my grief. If I had gone to California, I would have been with strangers who did not understand me. Here, with you, I feel understood even when we struggle with words." Maddox's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to reach out to pull her close, but he held himself back. She had been through so much, was dependent on him for her very survival. Any feelings he might be developing were inappropriate, taking advantage of the situation. But when Yara reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his just as she had by the fire, he did not pull away. November arrived with bitter cold and heavy snows that effectively trapped them in the cabin for days at a time. They fell into an easy domesticity that Maddox had never experienced before. Mornings, he would wake to find Yara already up, preparing tea and breakfast. They would eat together, then spend the day on various tasks. She sewed and mended while he carved and repaired tools. They cooked together, her teaching him Persian dishes adapted to available ingredients, him showing her how to prepare wild game. And always, they talked. Hours and hours of conversation as they both became more fluent in each other's languages. Yara told him about growing up in Persia, about the gardens and bazaars, and the call to prayer that echoed through the streets. She spoke of her father's lessons, how he had insisted on educating her as thoroughly as her brother despite social disapproval. She described her mother's gentleness, her brother's mischievous nature, and Maddox listened to all of it, hungry for every detail of who she had been before tragedy reshaped her life. In turn, he shared his own history. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, the excitement of heading off to war with his friends, the horror of what they actually found there. He talked about his brother's betrayal, though he realized as he told the story that the anger had faded. Rebecca seemed like someone from another lifetime, and his old life felt distant and unimportant compared to the simple contentment he found in this cabin with Yara. One evening in late November, a blizzard howled outside, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door. Inside, the cabin was warm and bright, fire crackling merrily. Yara was teaching Maddox a Persian song, laughing as he murdered the pronunciation and melody with equal enthusiasm. "No, no," she giggled, taking his hands. "Like this. The words flow together, not apart." She sang a phrase, her voice sweet and clear, and he tried again, doing slightly better. Her face lit up with delight, and in that moment, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes sparkling with laughter, Maddox thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He loved her, not just cared for her or felt responsible for her, but truly, deeply loved her. The feeling was different from what he had felt for Rebecca, more intense and real. He loved Yara's strength, her resilience, her quick mind and gentle humor. He loved how she hummed while cooking, how she always left tea steeping too long because she got distracted, how she had reorganized his entire cabin and somehow made it better. He loved her in English and in Persian and in all the languages of the world. Maddox. Yara's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you all right? You look strange." He shook himself, trying to clear his head. "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" She tilted her head, studying him with those perceptive dark eyes. He could not tell her. She was still healing, still grieving her family. She needed stability and safety, not the emotional complication of his feelings, so he deflected. "About how terrible my singing is. Even the wolves outside sound better." She laughed and swatted his arm. "You just need practice." Everything improves with practice. If she only knew how much he was practicing not reaching for her, not pulling her into his arms, not confessing everything he felt. December brought longer nights and deeper cold. Maddox's beard grew thick, and Yara took to trimming it for him, standing close while wielding his sharp knife with steady hands. The intimacy of it, her fingers on his jaw, her face inches from his, was sweet torture. They developed new traditions without realizing it. Morning tea by the window, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Evening meals eaten slowly, stretching out the time together. Reading before bed, Maddox from his worn collection of books, Yara from the papers she had carried from her old life, teaching him bits of Persian poetry that made his heart ache with their beauty. One night, Yara could not sleep. She sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and Maddox woke to find her there. He should have stayed in his bed, given her space, but instead he got up and sat beside her. "Bad dreams?" he asked quietly in Persian. She nodded. "I dreamed of the attack. I hear my mother's voice calling my name. When I woke up, for a moment I forgot where I was, forgot that she's gone." Maddox put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him without hesitation. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate words for devastating loss. "You think it gets easier?" Yara asked. "The grief?" "It gets different," Maddox replied honestly. "You learn to carry it. Some days are harder than others, but you're stronger than you know, Yara. You've survived so much already." She turned her face into his shoulder, and he felt the dampness of tears through his shirt. "I'm tired of being strong. I'm tired of surviving. I want to live again, to feel something other than sadness." Her words echoed his own buried desires. He tightened his arm around her, resting his cheek against her hair. You will, give it time. They stayed that way until the fire burned low, and when Yara finally returned to bed, she slept peacefully through the rest of the night. Christmas approached, and Maddox found himself wanting to mark the occasion for Yara's sake. She had mentioned Persian New Year celebrations, and though this was not her holiday, he thought perhaps it would help to have something to celebrate. He made a trip through the snow to check his trap line and returned with a rabbit, and by sheer luck, a young deer. He carved a simple wooden comb for her as a gift, knowing she struggled to work the tangles from her long hair with just her fingers. It was rough work, his hands more accustomed to survival than artistry, but he smoothed it carefully and carved a simple flower pattern along the handle. On Christmas morning, he woke to find Yara had already been up for hours. She had used some of their precious flour to make a special bread, shaped in an intricate pattern he did not recognize. The cabin smelled wonderful, and she had even found some dried berries to make a compote. "What's all this?" he asked, surprised. "You have done so much for me," Yara said, suddenly shy. "I wanted to do something in return. This is a special bread my mother used to make for celebrations. I thought for Christmas we could celebrate." Maddox's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you. I have something for you too." He produced the comb, and Yara's eyes went wide. She took it reverently, running her fingers over the carved pattern. "You made this. For me, it's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "I know it's rough. It's perfect," she whispered. Then, before he could react, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Maddox. It's the kindest gift anyone has ever given me." The feel of her lips on his skin, brief as it was, burned like a brand. Maddox stood frozen, his heart racing, as she sat down and immediately began using the comb on her hair. She looked so happy, so at peace, and he knew in that moment that he would do anything to keep that expression on her face. They spent Christmas Day together in comfortable companionship, eating Yara's special bread and the venison Maddox prepared. They sang songs, hers in Persian and his in English, neither caring that they did not understand all the words. As the short winter day faded into night, Maddox realized he had never been happier, not in all his 28 years. January brought a break in the weather, a stretch of clear, cold days that let Maddox get outside to hunt and check his traps. Yara bundled up and came with him sometimes, learning to move through the snow and observe the forest the way he did. He taught her to read tracks, to identify trees and plants, to understand the language of the wilderness. She was a quick learner, attentive and curious, and he found he enjoyed teaching her, sharing this knowledge that had kept him alive. One afternoon, they were following deer tracks through a snowy meadow when Yara suddenly stopped, staring at something ahead. Maddox followed her gaze and saw a wolf watching them from the tree line. It was a magnificent animal, its gray coat thick with winter fur, amber eyes intelligent and wary. "Should we run?" Yara whispered, her hand finding his. "No," Maddox said quietly. "Just stay calm. He's alone, probably just curious." They stood motionless as the wolf studied them. After a long moment it turned and trotted away, disappearing into the trees like smoke. Yara let out a breath she had been holding. "I was frightened," she admitted, "but also amazed. He was beautiful." "The wilderness is like that," Maddox said. "Dangerous and beautiful at the same time. You have to respect it, but you don't have to fear it." Yara looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. "Like you," she said softly. "When I first saw you, I was terrified. You were so big, so wild-looking, but you've been nothing but gentle with me." Maddox felt heat rise in his face, unaccustomed to such direct observation. "You'd been through trauma, anyone would have been gentle." "No," Yara shook her head. "Not anyone. Many men would have seen a foreign woman alone and helpless. They would have taken advantage. But you learned my language so I would not be lonely. You gave up your bed and your solitude. You taught me to survive in this place. Why? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Maddox could deflect again, could hide behind practicality and propriety. But something in Yara's eyes, a hope and vulnerability that matched his own, made him want to be honest. Because from the moment I found you, I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering more than you already had, he said slowly, speaking in Persian so there could be no misunderstanding. Because your loneliness called to mine. Because having you in my cabin in my life makes me happier than I've been in years. Because I care about you, Yara, more than I probably should. Her eyes widened, lips parting in surprise. The moment stretched, and Maddox braced himself for rejection, for the inevitable explanation that she saw him only as her rescuer, nothing more. Instead, Yara stepped closer, closing the distance between them. More than you should, she repeated, or exactly as much as I hoped. Maddox's heart stopped. Yara, I don't want you to feel obligated. You depend on me, and I would never want to take advantage of that. You think I don't know my own heart? She reached up, cupping his bearded jaw with one small hand. I'm not some fragile thing who doesn't understand her own feelings. Yes, I was lost and grieving when you found me. Yes, I depended on you for survival. But Maddox, the way I feel about you now has nothing to do with obligation or gratitude. How do you feel? His voice came out rougher than he intended, emotion making it gravelly. Like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for, she said softly. My family came to America seeking a better life, and they died before they could find it. I thought I had lost everything. But then you found me, and you learned my language, and you made me laugh again. You made me want to live again, not just survive. When I imagine leaving this cabin, going back to the world, the only thing I can think is that I don't want to go anywhere you aren't. Maddox could not breathe, could not think beyond the reality of her words and the hope flooding his chest. I love you, he said, the words breaking free. I've loved you for weeks, maybe from the beginning. I love your strength and your laughter and how you reorganized my entire cabin without asking. I love hearing you speak Persian and teaching you English. I love that you leave tea steeping too long and that you hum while you cook. I love you in ways I didn't know I could love someone. Tears spilled down Yara's cheeks, but she was smiling, radiant with joy. I love you too. In Persian, in English, in any language, I love you. Maddox cupped her face in his large hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she only rose up to meet him. Their lips touched, gentle at first, then deeper as weeks of restrained feeling poured into the kiss. She tasted like honey and tea, felt like everything he had ever wanted, and Maddox thought he might die from the perfection of holding her in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yara laughed softly. We're standing in the snow confessing our love. Shouldn't we be somewhere warm? Maddox grinned, an expression so rare it transformed his usually serious face. Practical, even now. Someone has to be, since you just spent 5 minutes kissing me while we both freeze. He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine, and took her hand. Come on then. Let's go home. The word home had never sounded better. Back at the cabin, they could not seem to stop touching, making up for all the weeks of careful distance. Maddox pulled Yara into his lap as they sat by the fire, and she curled against his broad chest like she belonged there. They talked for hours, making plans and confessing secret hopes. I want to marry you, Maddox said eventually. Properly, if you'll have me. We can go to Winnetka when the weather clears, find the minister. Are you proposing? Yara asked, her eyes dancing with amusement. Maddox shifted, suddenly nervous. I suppose I am. Yara, will you marry me? Yes, she said without hesitation. Though I should warn you, I know nothing about being a mountain man's wife. You've been doing it for months already, he pointed out, and doing it well. She kissed him again, slow and sweet. Then yes, Maddox Dalton, I will marry you. The rest of the winter passed in a haze of happiness. They were still snowed in, still isolated from the world, but now they faced it together as partners rather than rescuer and rescued. The cabin felt different, warmer, more alive with their shared joy. Maddox taught Yara to shoot his rifle, standing behind her to correct her stance, his arms around her as she learned to sight down the barrel. She proved to be a natural, and by late February could hit targets with impressive accuracy. "You'll be able to hunt with me come spring," he said proudly after she successfully shot a rabbit. "Good," Yara replied. "Then you can't leave me behind anymore." As if he ever wanted to be apart from her again. They talked about the future, about whether to stay in the mountains or move closer to civilization. Maddox had money saved from years of trapping, enough to buy land if they wanted. But Yara surprised him by saying she loved the isolation, the peace of the mountains as much as he did. "I spent my whole life surrounded by people," she explained. "Always expectations, always rules about how a woman should behave. Here I can be myself. I can shoot guns and wear pants and not worry about propriety. Here I'm free." "We could still visit Winnetka sometimes," Maddox said. "You shouldn't be completely cut off from people." "Sometimes is different from always," Yara pointed out. "Besides, you're all the company I need." March brought the first signs of spring, and with it, the melting of snow and the opening of the pass to Winnetka. Maddox and Yara made the journey together, ready to make their union official. The town was buzzing with gossip when they arrived. The hermit mountain man bringing a foreign woman to be married was the most exciting thing to happen in months. Some people were kind, congratulating them and welcoming Yara. Others were less so, making their disapproval of a foreigner clear. Maddox kept Yara close, his size and stern expression discouraging anyone from saying anything directly unpleasant. At the church, they met with Reverend Paul, a kind older man who had known Maddox before he retreated to the mountains. "I'm happy to marry you," Reverend Paul said, "but I need to be certain the young lady understands what she's agreeing to and is entering this marriage of her own free will." "I understand English now," Yara said clearly, though her accent was still strong. "And I love Maddox. I want to marry him." The Reverend looked between them, seeing the obvious devotion in their eyes, and smiled. "Then I'll be honored to perform the ceremony." They were married 3 days later, on a sunny spring morning with wildflowers just beginning to bloom. Yara wore a simple dress they had purchased at the general store, her long dark hair loose and crowned with spring flowers Maddox had picked that morning. He wore his cleanest clothes, his hair and beard neatly trimmed, and could not take his eyes off his bride. Samuel from the general store stood as witness, along with his wife Martha, a motherly woman who had taken an instant liking to Yara. The ceremony was simple, the words familiar and binding, and when Reverend Paul pronounced them husband and wife, Maddox kissed Yara with a joy that radiated through the small church. "You may have your doubts about a foreign bride," Martha said firmly to anyone who would listen at the small reception she insisted on hosting. "But I've never seen two people more suited to each other. That girl looks at him like he hung the moon, and he looks at her like she is the moon. Love is love, no matter what language it speaks." They spent one night at the boarding house before heading back to the mountains, eager to begin their life together as husband and wife. The cabin welcomed them back like an old friend, and Maddox carried Yara over the threshold, making her laugh. "New beginning," he said in Persian. "New beginning," she agreed in English and kissed him. Their marriage bed was soft with furs, warmed by the fire, and Maddox was infinitely gentle with his wife, worshipping her with hands and lips until she gasped his name in 2 languages. Afterward, she lay curled against his broad chest, tracing patterns on his skin. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she murmured. "After everything that happened, I thought joy was something for other people, but you gave it back to me." Maddox pressed a kiss to her hair. "You gave it to me too. I was just existing before, going through the motions of living. You made me want to really live again." Spring turned to summer, and they fell into the rhythms of mountain life. Yara proved to be an excellent hunter and tracker, though she drew the line at skinning animals, leaving that to Maddox. She planted a garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rocky soil, and took pride in providing variety to their diet. Maddox expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a proper porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the valley. They made love under the stars, beside the creek, in their soft bed, always finding new ways to express the love that grew deeper with each passing day. Maddox never tired of hearing Yara speak Persian, the rolling syllables of endearments that made his heart race. She delighted in his rough English declarations, insisting they were the most romantic words she had ever heard. One July evening, as they sat on their new porch watching fireflies dance in the meadow, Yara took Maddox's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "I'm going to have your baby." Maddox went completely still, processing the words. A baby. A child created from their love. The idea terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. "Are you sure?" "Very sure." She smiled at him, radiant with joy and a hint of nervousness. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "I love you. I love our baby. I love the life we're building. Even though it's isolated, even though our child will grow up far from other children, we can make trips to town more often," Maddox said. "Make sure our son or daughter knows how to be around people. But yes, I think a child could have a good life here. Fresh air, open spaces, parents who love them. What more do they need?" Yara kissed him, slow and deep. "You're going to be a wonderful father." "And you'll be an amazing mother," he replied. "Teaching our child 2 languages, 2 cultures, they'll be lucky to have you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Maddox was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, making Yara laugh when he insisted she rest more and lift less. But his devotion was sweet, and she loved watching him prepare for their child, building a cradle with his own hands and carving toys with infinite patience. Martha from Winnetka visited twice, making the long journey to check on Yara and bring supplies. She taught Yara what to expect during the birth and assured Maddox that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, usually without men hovering and worrying. "That may be," Maddox replied. "But this is my wife and my child. I'm going to worry." Martha just laughed and patted his arm. "At least you care. That's more than many husbands." Winter came again, and with it, the isolation of heavy snows. But this year, the cabin felt full and warm, anticipation building as they waited for their child. Yara taught Maddox Persian lullabies, her sweet voice filling the cabin with melody. He read to her from his books, including the few children's stories he had, practicing for when their son or daughter would be old enough to listen. On a February morning during a brief break in the storms, Yara woke Maddox with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said calmly. "The baby is coming." Maddox, who had faced down bears and survived a war, had never been more terrified in his life. But he did not let it show, instead helping Yara through her labor with steady hands and encouraging words. Martha had left detailed instructions, and he followed them as best he could, praying he was doing everything right. Labor was long and difficult, testing them both. Maddox held Yara's hand, let her squeeze until his bones ached, wiped her face with cool cloths, and told her how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. She bore it with courage, though he could see the fear beneath her determination. Finally, as dawn light broke through the window, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. Maddox caught him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny, perfect life he and Yara had created. The baby had dark hair like his mother and strong lungs that he was using to announce his displeasure at the cold world. "A boy," Maddox said hoarsely, carefully placing their son in Yara's waiting arms. "We have a son." Yara looked down at their child with exhausted wonder, touching his tiny face with gentle fingers. "He's beautiful, perfect." Their son quieted at his mother's voice, seeming to recognize it even minutes after birth. Maddox sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Yara, staring at his new family with overwhelming love. "What should we name him?" Yara asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, wanting something that honored both their cultures. "What about Darius?" Maddox suggested. "It's Persian but also used in America. And it means he who holds firm to good. I like that." "Darius Dalton," Yara tested the name. "Yes, I love it. Hello, Darius. Welcome to the world, my son." The baby made a small sound and both parents laughed, giddy with exhaustion and joy. The first weeks with a newborn were challenging. Darius woke frequently, hungry and loud, and both Maddox and Yara stumbled through their days exhausted but happy. Maddox proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with his son at night so Yara could rest, speaking to him in both English and his slowly improving Persian. "He should know your language as well as mine," Maddox insisted. "It's part of his heritage." Yara fell even more in love with her husband watching him with their son. Maddox, so large and rough and capable with survival, was infinitely gentle with Darius, holding him like he was made of glass, singing off key lullabies that made the baby calm. As winter gave way to spring, Darius grew strong and alert. His eyes, initially dark, lightened to a striking gray like his father's. He was a happy baby, content to watch his parents work, fascinated by the play of light through the cabin windows. They made a trip to Winnetka when Darius was 3 months old, showing him off to Martha and Samuel, who cooed over him appropriately. Reverend Paul blessed the baby in a small ceremony, and even the townspeople who had been suspicious of Yara softened at the sight of the small family so clearly devoted to each other. "That baby will grow up wild," one woman said, though not unkindly. "Living up in those mountains." "He'll grow up free," Martha corrected. "With parents who love him and teach him. Could be worse fates." The years passed in a blur of happiness. Darius grew from infant to toddler to small boy, running wild in the mountains with his parents, learning to track and hunt and read and write. He spoke English and Persian with equal fluency, switching between them without thought. Maddox taught him to carve and shoot, to read the weather and respect the wilderness. Yara taught him poetry and mathematics, history and compassion. When Darius was 4, his sister arrived, a tiny girl with her mother's dark hair and delicate features. They named her Lily, and she wrapped her father around her little finger from the moment of her birth. Darius took his role as big brother seriously, always watching over his sister, teaching her things his parents had taught him. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family. Maddox built additional rooms, created a larger porch, even added glass windows he hauled from Winnetka. The garden grew more extensive under Yara's care, and they kept chickens and eventually a milk cow. Their isolated life was full and rich, lacking nothing important. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Maddox and Yara stood on their porch watching their children play in the meadow. Darius, now 9, was teaching 6-year-old Lily how to identify animal tracks, his young voice patient and excited. "You ever regret it?" Maddox asked, putting his arm around Yara's waist. "This life, so far from everything." Yara leaned into him, comfortable in his embrace after a decade of marriage. "Never, do you? Not for a single second." He kissed her temple. "You gave me everything I didn't know I needed. A family, a purpose, a reason to be part of the world again." "You did the same for me," Yara replied. "When you found me, I had lost everything. I thought my life was over. But you learned my language so I wouldn't be alone, and in doing that, you gave me a new life. A better life than I ever imagined." They watched their children, the product of their love and two cultures blending seamlessly. Darius was showing Lily how to follow the deer tracks, his small hand taking hers as they walked. The sight made Yara's eyes water. "They are so lucky," she said. "Growing up with such freedom, with parents from different worlds who chose each other." "We're the lucky ones," Maddox corrected. "I found you in those mountains and you became my whole world." "I love you," Yara said in Persian, the language of her childhood. "I love you," Maddox replied in English, the language of his. Their children echoed the sentiment back in both languages, making their parents laugh. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the family gathered on the porch. Maddox held Lily on his lap while Yara sat with Darius, and they sang songs in 2 languages, their voices blending in harmony. The wilderness stretched around them, beautiful and wild, full of challenges and wonders. But inside their cabin and their family, there was only love, acceptance, and the knowledge that they had built something precious together. A refugee who had lost everything had found a home. A lonely mountain man had found a family. And 2 people who should never have met had created a life together that was richer than anything they could have imagined. In the years that followed, their family continued to thrive. Darius grew into a strong young man who moved fluidly between mountain life and civilization, eventually marrying a kind woman from Winnetka and building his own cabin nearby. Lily proved to have her mother's quick mind and her father's practical skills, becoming a teacher who traveled between isolated mountain families, bringing education to children who otherwise would have none. But Maddox and Yara remained in their original cabin, the place where their love had grown from desperate survival into something enduring and true. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming weathered, but their love never diminishing. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch, hands intertwined, and remember the terror of their first meeting, the patience of learning each other's languages, the moment they realized friendship had become love, the joy of their children and, eventually, grandchildren. "Do you remember," Yara would say, "when you first tried to speak Persian? You sounded like you were choking on the words." "Do you remember," Maddox would reply, "when you tried to shoot my rifle and fell over backward from the recoil?" They would laugh, the sound carrying across the meadow where their grandchildren played, and thank whatever fate had brought them together. Maddox never regretted learning Persian, those long winter evenings spent struggling with unfamiliar sounds and grammar. It had been the greatest gift he could give, the effort that showed Yara she was not alone in a foreign land. And from that gift had grown everything else. When Maddox was 60, sitting on his porch with his wife of 32 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, he reflected on the path his life had taken. He had gone into the mountains seeking isolation, running from pain and disappointment. But the mountains had given him back so much more than he ever lost. They had given him Yara. "Thank you," he said suddenly in Persian, the language as familiar now as his native English. "For what?" Yara asked, looking up from the shawl she was knitting for their newest grandchild. "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for building this life with me, for teaching our children to be bridges between worlds, for being the best thing that ever happened to me." Yara set down her knitting and took his weathered hand. "The best thing that happened to me was being found by a man kind enough to learn my language so I would not feel alone. Everything else grew from that kindness." They kissed, soft and sweet, as the sun set over the Wyoming mountains they had called home for over 3 decades. Around them, their family laughed and talked in 2 languages, a living testament to the power of love crossing all barriers. The refugee who spoke no English had found her voice. The mountain man who sought isolation had found connection. And together, they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and acceptance and the simple truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with choosing not to let someone face their loneliness alone. Years later, when they were both old and gray, Maddox and Yara would still be found on their porch each evening, hands intertwined, speaking in the hybrid language they had created together. Their children would bring them news from Winnetka and beyond, but the old couple was content in their mountain sanctuary, surrounded by memories and love. On one such evening, with fireflies dancing in the meadow and their great-grandchildren playing nearby, Yara turned to Maddox with tears in her eyes. "I've been so happy," she said simply. "Even with all the loss at the beginning, I've been so incredibly happy." Maddox pulled her close, this woman who had been his whole world for 4 decades. "So have I, my love, so have I." When the end came for them, it came peacefully, years later with both of them in their 80s. They passed within days of each other, unable to bear being apart even in death. Their family buried them on the mountainside they loved, overlooking the valley with the cabin where their love story had unfolded. On their shared headstone, their children carved an inscription in both English and Persian. "Here lie Maddox and Yara Dalton." He learned her language so she would not be alone. She taught him that love needs no translation. And in the cabin they built together, their descendants would tell the story for generations. The story of a mountain man who found a refugee and learned an entire language just so she would not feel alone. The story of a woman who lost everything and found love in the wilderness. The story of 2 people who should never have met, but who, meeting, created something beautiful and lasting and true. Their love became legend in Winnetka and the surrounding mountains, a reminder that compassion and connection can bloom even in the harshest circumstances. That sometimes, the greatest act of love is simply ensuring someone knows they are not alone. And on quiet evenings in the mountains of Wyoming, when the wind whispers through the pines and the sun sets gold over the peaks, some say you can still hear an echo of 2 voices speaking in harmony, one in English and one in Persian, saying the same words, "I love you," forever, in every language, in every world.